what we're going to do, first me, then Kate, and then I'll come back at the end, is, I think, I suspect tell you what you already know. By which I mean that I think everyone has had, at least a great many people, an intuition that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. You know, that goes back, you can see it in the, you know, equality, liberty, fraternity, equality in the French Revolution. And what I think the data we're going to show you tells us is that that intuition is extraordinarily true. I had worked for a great many years on a tendency for more equal countries, that's countries with smaller income differences between rich and poor, to be healthier. But I was very slow to realize that that might apply not just to ill health, which is more common in the poorest areas of our society, but to a whole range of other social problems which have the same pattern. So we're going to take you through that data. The differences are extraordinarily large. I mean, you find huge differences in homicide rates and drug abuse and child well-being and so on from one rich country to another. And that is partly because these effects of inequality don't just affect the poor. They affect almost all of us to different degrees. And so what we're really talking about is the real quality of life for the vast majority of the populations now in the rich developed countries. I'm going to start with a slide which really draws attention to a paradox. That income means very little anymore, but if you can look at the differences in average income levels between the rich developed countries, and yet they're very important within our societies. So here you have national income per person and life expectancy. And these little grey dots that might be, I don't know, tiny clouds from where you're sitting, are the names of the rich developed countries. So there's Japan, and if I get a little bit closer, there's Sweden, Spain, Israel, Greece, UK, USA is there, Norway, rich developed market democracies. And you see some of them are twice as rich as others. And the currencies are converted in a way to take account of prices in those different countries. So people in these countries can buy twice as much of everything as people in those countries, and yet it makes no difference at all to life expectancy. That is despite knowing that health is much worse in the poorest inner city areas and so on. And yet in between, within each of these countries is a social gradient in health like that. These are age-adjusted mortality rates of white men in US zip code areas. It's rather old data. They're classified by the median income of the zip code areas, so they're the richest ones with low death rates and the poorest ones with high death rates. And this isn't just a difference between the poor and the rest of society, it's a difference all the way across the society. It often seems to me that this is one of the biggest human rights or social justice issues facing modern societies, that huge difference in life expectancy. It varies. In some societies there's a sort of 3, 4, 5-year differences in life expectancy between top and bottom. In others it might be 15 years or even more. But anyway, what this paradox draws our attention to, that income is important within societies but not between them, is that we're dealing with relative income, relative poverty, inequality, social status, social position, the differences between us, something like that. So keep that in mind, because we're going to be talking about inequality, the changes in the size of the differences between us. You may be surprised, of course, to show that I show you there's no difference between no relationship between life expectancy and national income in the rich developed countries. But of course, the poor countries, economic growth is really important. And in the early stages of economic growth, life expectancy improves very fast. I was just showing you these countries out here. You know, having more money, more food, more of everything, better shelter, better clothing is really important in the poorer countries. But when you get to the rich developed countries, it doesn't help us anymore. Interestingly, if I showed you a graph of happiness, it would look almost exactly the same. You'd have to read the labels to be sure which you were looking at. So instead of life expectancy here, put happiness here. Important rises in the early stages of development and then petering out. If you look at well-being within our societies over a period of time when perhaps levels of income double or treble, you find levels of measures of well-being are completely flat, unresponsive to our economic growth. We are the first generation to get to the end of what economic growth can do for us. It's been much the most important way of raising the real quality of human life for centuries. But we've got to the end of that. And we've got to the end of it just at the time when we realize how damaging further economic growth is for the environment and the need to rein in carbon emissions by perhaps 80 or 90% in the rich developed countries. We're going to talk a lot about inequality, but we're never talking about any hypothetical level of, perfect equality or anything like that. What we're doing is comparing the differences in inequality between different rich developed societies. The measure we use is how much richer the top 20% in each country than the bottom 20%. And these are the countries for which we have good data. And you see in the most equal countries, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the top 20% in each of those countries is 3.5 or 4 times as rich. In the more unequal countries, the UK, Portugal, the USA, they're 7, 8, 8.5 times as rich. So we are, on that measure, twice as unequal as these countries. And what we're going to be doing is show you the implications of that, showing you the effects that has on the quality of social life and the way our societies work. I think increasingly people are perhaps worried about the contrast between the, if you like, the material success of our societies, despite the recession, and the social failings. And I think if we'd been living in the 19th century and we'd heard about the sort of standard of living which was coming in 100 years' time, we'd have thought, life is going to be just so wonderful. It's really hard to believe that we're going to be worried about crime and violence and drug abuse and teenage births and, all the other problems, mental illness, things like that. But actually that's what we're preoccupied with. The media are just full of social problems all the time. There's prison overcrowding, this is teenage births, antisocial behavior, drug abuse, all sorts of things that we worry about, uneasy about the social development of our societies. Kate and I collected data wherever we could find comparable data from reputable sources for health and social problems of the kind which you expect to be worse in the more in the poorest areas of our society. Problems with those social gradients that I showed you, like the health ones. We got data for life expectancy in each country. We got children's maths and literacy scores, which you can compare between countries. Infant mortality rates, homicide rates, levels of imprisonment, what proportion of the population is imprisoned in each country, teenage birth rates, levels of trust, that's how much people feel they can trust others, obesity rates, mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction, and social mobility. That was just initially all we could find socially comparable, internationally comparable data on. We put them all into one index, and what we called our index of health and social problems. So a sort of rag bag of whatever we had found. And they're weighted equally, so where a country is influenced as much by trust as it is by homicides or how kids do get on at school. And here you see it related to income inequality. That measure I've just shown you. So on the right-hand end are the more unequal countries, which have worse outcomes in terms of all these health and social problems in the index. And at the more equal end, countries doing much, much better. That doesn't look like a correlation out of the social sciences. It looks like physics with a bit of measurement error. And it really is, it's extraordinarily close. You know, every little step rise in inequality produces more of all these problems. And interestingly, if you put that same index of health and social problems in relation to national income per person instead of inequality, there's no relationship. I sometimes think people think there's beginning to be a suggestion of a relationship down there, but that's only because Portugal's there. And don't forget USA is up there. Statistically, there's no relationship at all. We were rather surprised by the strength of these relationships with inequality, and although we can tell from the statistics that these aren't just chance findings, can't be dismissed as chance, we thought we should test it all out in a second setting. So as well as that set of international comparisons, we also looked at the same question in the 50 states of the USA, asking the same question. Do the more equal states do better on all these things? And the picture is very substantially the same. It's not such a close fit, but it's highly statistically significant, a tendency for the more unequal states to have worse outcomes on almost exactly the same index of health and social problems. We managed to get almost all those variables that go into it for the 50 states. We were also worried that people might think that we'd chosen problems to suit our argument. So we thought we did a paper in the British Medical Journal on the United Nations Index of Child Wellbeing in rich countries. That was important for us simply because we did not compile that index. We did not choose what went into it. In fact, it has 40 different components. They include things like whether kids can talk to their parents and is there bullying at school. How do they get on in these maths and literacy tests? What are immunization rates like? So all sorts of aspects of child well-being go into that United Nations index. And there it is in relation to inequality. Again, a strong relationship. USA, exactly the levels of child well-being that would be predicted from its levels of inequality. The UK doing substantially worse than we'd predict for our levels of inequality. We're doing worst of all there. But look at these countries up here, how well they're doing. Put that same UNICEF index of child well-being in relation to national income per person, and there's absolutely no relationship. We talk about child poverty as the problem, but that doesn't mean economic growth is going to solve it, even if we have trickle-down. If the whole society gets richer together, it does nothing for children. What child well-being needs is reducing the differences between us. It's a matter of how far behind the rest of us they are. I'm going to now hand over to Kate, who will show you some of the features of the different components of that index.
Hello, I thought you were going to hand me over to them. To the angry mob. I'm afraid you might be an angry mob by the time I've finished, but I hope not with me. I lived here in the USA for 16 years, and it's nice to be back. But I'm afraid I am going to show you slide after slide after slide where you guys are at the bottom. That one that Richard just showed you where we're at the bottom, I think that's probably the only one. No, I'm exaggerating a little bit. And it's lovely to be in Seattle tonight and to meet, first time in a long time, one of my students who's here, and to see that she's come out on a rainy night to listen to this, as have all of you. She should probably be at home working on her dissertation. So we can have a chat about that later. All right, we'll start with levels of trust. These are different countries, and up the side here we have the proportion of people in those countries who think that most others can be trusted. And these data are collected by the World Values Survey. And what they do is they go to different countries and they take random samples of the population and they ask them, do you think most other people can be trusted? Or do you think they're out for themselves? And up here we have Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, and around 2/3 of the population think that others can be trusted. And down at the bottom end here, actually you're not doing so badly on that one, are you? It's around 1/5 of the population. So that's a scale of the difference. And I want you to think about what it feels like to live in those different places, to be in a place where if you're out on the street, encountering strangers, walking home alone as a woman, travelling on public transport, working in different institutions, what it feels like if you know that the vast majority of the people you meet trust you and you feel you can trust them, compared to a society where only a small minority of people feel they can trust others. And here are levels of trust in the 50 US states. And these data come from your General Social Survey, which does exactly the same thing as the World Values Survey internationally. Random samples of the population in each state asked the same question, do you think most other people can be trusted or not? And the scale of differences is really similar. Up here at the more equal end, there's New Hampshire, Utah, Wisconsin, Iowa, Vermont, North Dakota. Again, around 2/3 of the population thinking that other people can be trusted. And down at the more unequal end, it's more like 1/3. So the same scale of differences, the same range of kinds of society, the same feelings associated with being in a very trusting place, one that's public-spirited, socially cohesive, community-minded, compared to one where very few people feel like that. Let's move on to mental illness. These data come from the World Health Organization's consortium, which is set up to measure mental illness in different countries so that we can compare it. And up the side here, we've got the percent of the population who've had some kind of mental illness in the past year. This is the adult population. And down here at the more equal end, here's Japan, Germany, Spain. It's less than 10% of the adult population who've had some kind of illness in the past 12 months. Up here, Australia, the UK, 23% of our adult population have been mentally ill in the past year, and for you, it's 26%, so more than 1 in 4. And the scale of those differences tell you something really important. We're not looking at a problem here confined to the poorest segment of our population. We're not looking at a problem here confined to a small minority group. 26% of the population is too big to be explained by what's going on at the very bottom or in any particular subgroups. Moving on to physical health. These are death rates for working-age men, and the green dots are US states. They're bigger if the state has a large population and smaller if it's smaller. And then down at the more equal end, those red ones are the Canadian provinces. They tend to be more equal than the US states. And you can see a strong tendency for lower levels of mortality in the more equal states and provinces. And there have been close to 200 studies of the effect of income inequality on physical health, and it's a very robust relationship. Here are levels of violence. These are murder rates. And just as there have been a lot of studies of income inequality and health, there have been about 50 studies at least of income inequality and violent crime. Again, these are the US states. Those are the circles, if you can tell. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to distinguish, but the Canadian provinces are down here and they're triangles. Here, this is the more unequal end, and here's the more equal end. And down at the more equal end in these Canadian provinces, there are about 15 murders per million people per year. And up at the more unequal end here, it's about 150 per million people per year. So a tenfold difference, closely related to levels of inequality. And here are teenage birth rates. Down at the lower end, Japan, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands here, fewer than 10 births per 1,000 young women aged 15 to 19. The UK has the worst teenage birth rate in Europe, and there's the USA up here. somewhere close to 50. And actually, the differences are even starker or more important than you can see in this graph. Down here in Japan, which has got the lowest rate, over 80% of those young women are actually, they're married. In the UK and in the USA, it's sort of the reverse. The vast majority of our teen mums are unmarried and having their babies in very different kind of social context. And here's drug use. We got these data from the United Nations. It's an index of opiates, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, and amphetamines, so illegal drug use. We've put them into an index, and we find a significant tendency for the more unequal countries to have a higher level of drug use than the more equal ones. And here's rates of imprisonment. This one looks very like the figure Richard showed you earlier of our index of health and social problems. It's such a tight, close relationship. If you know a country's level of inequality, you can pretty accurately predict its level of imprisonment. Now, this is on a slightly different scale than we use for all our other graphs. This one's on a log scale. And that means the difference between 10 and 100 on this scale is the same as between 100 and 1,000. And we've had to do that, I'm afraid, to fit you on. Because otherwise the relationship would curve up there somewhere. And of course, the only other one that wouldn't be useful to make an accurate prediction from is Greece, which has an unusually low level of imprisonment. And it should be even lower because 2 of them escaped recently. And the only reason we know that was because it was a big story in our news back home, because they did it rather spectacularly. A helicopter landed in the prison yard and they got in and flew away. That wasn't actually the most spectacular bit of the story. The most spectacular bit was it was the second time they'd done it. But it's not really funny, is it, this? And rates of imprisonment aren't particularly closely correlated with crime rates. What we're seeing here is a tendency for more unequal societies to have harsher judicial systems, to be more likely to send people to prison who come into the criminal justice system, and for them to be more likely to send them away for longer. In the UK, our crime rates have been coming down, and our prison rates have been skyrocketing. Here are rates of imprisonment in your states. We've coloured in red the ones that have retained the death penalty, and in blue those that have abolished it. And you can see a tendency for the more equal states to have abolished the death penalty. But again, the scale of differences between equal and unequal states is large, around 200 prisoners per 100,000 in the more equal ones, more like 700 in the most unequal states. And here's child conflict. This is an index of the percentage of kids who report having been fighting in different countries. They've been aggressive towards other children, combined with the proportion of those who say they have been bullied, somebody has been aggressive to them, along with the proportion of those who find that their peers aren't kind or helpful. And so we can see that the lack of trust and the levels of violence being measured in the adult population are also being experienced by our children, with significantly higher levels of conflict in the more unequal countries than in the more equal ones. And here's education. We could have showed you educational scores on maths and literacy tests, comparing different countries and comparing different states. But this one is the proportion of kids who drop out of high school. So down in the more equal states, it's 10 to 15% of kids who drop out without finishing, and up in the more unequal states, it's around a quarter. And here's the last of my sort of individual components of our index of health and social problems. This is social mobility, which is a hard thing to measure. And what's been done here, and these data were produced by researchers at the London School of Economics, is a measure that correlates a father's income when his son is born with the son's income 30 years later. So it's intergenerational income mobility. Do rich parents have rich children, or not particularly? And up here, where the correlation is low, so social mobility is high, We have Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Canada, and Germany. We don't have these data for many countries because not many countries have collected that kind of information for long enough. But down here, here's the UK and the land of opportunity and the American dream. So those are all of the individual components, and we've shown you them separately just to give you an idea of the scale of the differences and the consistency of the patterns. But the next point we want to make is that almost all of us benefit from living in a more equal society, and that although the benefits are greatest for the poorest among us, they extend all the way up the population. It's hard to do these kinds of studies as well, because you need to be able to compare people at the same socioeconomic position in different countries, and that's quite hard to do. But there have been some studies that give us this kind of information. These are data on chronic diseases in white men from England and white men from the USA. Here for diabetes, here for hypertension, cancer, lung disease, and heart disease. And within each group of English men and American men, they're divided into those with the lowest third of education, the middle third, and the highest third. And so you can see generally there's a tendency for the most educated to be doing better than the least educated. But always it's better to be in slightly more equal England than the more unequal USA, even for the men in the top third of education. And here's some similar information from our own work in the United States. What we're looking up at the side here are death rates for US counties. It's about 3,000 counties here. And they're divided into those in more equal states and less equal states. And they're arranged by county median income, average income. So here, among the poorer counties, there's a clear benefit of living in a more equal state. Death rates are lower than in less equal states. But that difference extends all the way up the population, and even in the most affluent counties, there's a benefit from living in a more equal state than a less equal one. And here's some evidence from education. These are literacy scores of young adults in more equal Sweden, Canada, which comes in about the middle of the income inequality distribution, and the more unequal United States. And at this end are the educational scores of the least educated parents. And there's a big difference. It's much, much more important to be in more equal Sweden than in more unequal United States. But all the way up, even among the most educated parents, there's a difference in how well their children score on these literacy tests. So I hope we've made the case to you now that income inequality is related to a whole range of health and social problems, and that the benefits extend to the majority of the population. But I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the importance of equality as we move into an era where we need to cope with climate change and develop more sustainable economies. And Richard mentioned at the beginning how important it is for us to recognise that that's one of the reasons we have to deal with coming to the end of what economic growth can do for us. One of the really important things that happens in a more unequal society is that as the social distances get stretched out between us, status becomes more important, and competing for status becomes more important. And how do we demonstrate our status in our modern societies? We shop. We want bigger houses, we want better cars, we want clothes with designer labels on. Some of us, not me, want handbags that cost $1,000. We want the trappings of status. We want to show that we can compete, that we can keep up. But we know that we need to rein in consumerism. That's one of the most important things we're going to have to do to deal with carbon emissions. And there's some evidence that backs this up, that status competition becomes more important in more countries. Look how much longer working hours are in the more unequal countries. And here are the more equal countries down here. There's a huge difference in working hours, and it works out to about 9 extra weeks per year that people in more unequal countries are working, because status matters more and we've got to work more and earn more to keep up. But remember those graphs I showed you about trust right at the beginning when I started? We think that trust, greater levels of trust in more equal countries indicates more public spiritedness, less individualism, more willingness to cooperate with one another and work for the common good. And there's some evidence that shows that countries that are more equal act in this way. More equal countries are more generous foreign aid donors. Here's Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, the only countries that are actually giving above the UN targets for foreign aid. Well, I know it's great, but let them in, let them all come in. Unless it's the opposition, I suppose. Keep them out. And down here, the more unequal countries, oh, they're seriously annoyed, give far less. And here, more equal countries recycle more of their waste. There's an index of recycling here, and the ranking on it, the more equal countries doing much better, the more unequal ones recycling far less. More equal countries score higher on the Global Peace Index as well. And here, this is quite a surprising one. In more equal countries, business leaders are more willing to state that they think their government should comply with international environmental agreements. And in the more unequal ones, fewer of those business leaders think that that's important. And lastly, we hear from certain quarters the idea that we need some level of inequality. We need inequality to drive innovation, to drive creativity, to make people aspire and work harder and do better. Well, here's some evidence that that's not true. We find that more equal societies are actually more innovative. What we've got here is a measure of patents per capita, which is a sort of proxy measure for how innovative a society is, and a statistically significant tendency for the more equal countries to have a higher level of patents per capita and the more unequal ones fewer. So, by reining in consumerism, by being more public-spirited, cooperative and willing to act for the common good, and by being more innovative and fostering more of their potential human capital, more equal societies are better placed to deal with the challenges of climate change. So that's sort of all of the evidence we want to show you that we found. I'm going to hand back to Richard, and he's going to explain what we think lies behind all of these patterns.
Okay. Yes, I want to go back to this graph that you saw earlier, where we put all these different problems into the same index. I want to go back to it. First, to point out that all the graphs Kate has been showing you, it's always the same countries doing badly, and it's always the same ones doing well. What you're looking at is a sort of general social dysfunction related to inequality. It's not just one thing that goes wrong, it's most things that go wrong. So whether we're talking about trust, or teenage births, or life expectancy, or how well kids get on at school, or drugs, most of these things are worse in the same group of countries and better in others. That's a really important thing to understand. But we also need to look and think whether there are other ways of explaining this relationship. Are we right to be emphasizing inequality all the time? Look at the countries there and see if you can think of other explanations. People sometimes, without, I think, looking at our books and our graph, say that it's small countries that have good outcomes. That's not true. There's Portugal there. When we have data for it, Singapore is up there at the bad end too. And actually, the two biggest countries, the USA and Japan, are at opposite ends. If you weight the correlations for population size, the relationships are even tighter. Sometimes people say it's the English-speaking countries that do badly. It's culture, not inequality. Take the USA off, take UK off, take New Zealand and Australia off, and you've still got a significant relationship left. Or they say it's the Nordic cultures. They're strange people, the Nordics. You can take them off. and you've got a significant relationship up here. But we haven't just done it internationally amongst these countries. As I said, you get substantially the same picture looking at these issues amongst the American states, with totally different cultural history and so on. There are also some remarkable contrasts. I mean, look at Portugal there, and look at Spain, its close neighbour there. Think how similar their cultures are. Remember that they both had dictatorships till the mid-1970s, and yet they fare so differently now, and actually how they come out in terms of their health and social problems is closely predicted by their inequality. Look also at Sweden and Japan. It's hard to think of two more different countries in terms of culture amongst the OECD countries. And look at the position of women, or how closely they keep to the nuclear family. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum. Even how they get their greater equality is totally different. Sweden has very large differences in earnings, and it redistributes through taxes and benefits. It has big government, big welfare state. Japan, just the opposite. It has smaller differences in earnings before taxes and benefits, and much less government intervention of that kind. And we find a little bit of the same contrast between amongst some of the more equal American states. Vermont and New Hampshire, for instance. New Hampshire is rather more like Japan in that it has, I think, the lowest state taxation as a proportion of income of any state except Alaska, and lower social expenditure. But Vermont has higher state taxation and more redistribution. So it looks as if it doesn't matter how you get your greater equality as long as you get there somehow. We don't have to force the remedy of taxes and benefits on a society if they can do it other ways. We don't mind. You get the benefits either way. We should also try and think of, and people suggest that another explanation is ethnic mix or immigration or something like that. That's not an explanation at all. Kate has already shown you graphs which, for instance, compared simply white populations' death rates between more and less equal countries. We've shown you also that the benefits of greater equality are not just about a minority at the bottom, but extend right across the population. Also, some of there's some quite surprising similarities between countries at different ends. Sweden and the USA have rather similar proportions of foreign-born. Your greatest immigrant group, I think, are Hispanics from Mexico. Despite their poverty and low education, their health is remarkably good. It's almost, in some respects, it's almost as good as the health of non-Hispanic whites. It used to be, I think, called the Hispanic paradox. I haven't actually kept up with that area of research recently. So I don't think that's an explanation either. Reverse causality. Could it be all these problems that create the inequality? That, if there was something like that happening, it doesn't explain why all these problems should move together. Why should homicide be bad in the same country as, I don't know, literacy scores are bad, or drugs, or whatever else? Why do those? You've got to believe that there's a common cause for all those things. If you say they all happen to move together and cause the inequality, that's a really difficult problem to try and explain why they all move together in totally different contexts. Even, of course, and we do know that with the ideology, the monetarism and neoliberalism and so on that came in the 80s, I think, under Reagan here and Thatcher in Britain, that was a new economic ideology, a new political way of thinking, and it did allow inequalities to rise. No doubt about it. There was an ideological change that contributed to the rise in inequality. They lowered taxes, they changed trade union law, there were rises in income differences before taxation. But those governments never intended to give rise to increases in teenage births, imprisonment, homicide, drug addiction. Those are all unintended consequences of their actions. So I don't think you can argue that it's reverse causality like that. One thing I thought might explain this this problem, is increasingly in Britain, people talk about our broken society as perhaps caused by broken families. So to check that one out, we looked at the proportion of single parents in different countries. In Greece, only about 3 or 4% of their parents are single parents. In the USA, in UK, New Zealand, it's nearly 30%. And here it is in relation to the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing. There's no relationship. That's very surprising. I thought there must be some problem, and so consulted people who know much more about this than I do. But of course, the reason why there's no relationship, we do know within our societies that the children of single parents do less well. And all the academic arguments about how much of that poorer performance you can explain by the greater poverty of single parents or by maternal depression or things like that. What we do know, though, is some of these countries up here provide much better support for their single parents, a much smaller proportion of them in relative poverty than in the USA and UK. So it appears that governments can substantially offset the disadvantages that within our countries seem to go with being a child of a single parent. The other point that I think is worth making is that people worry, I think, that if you provide better support for single parents, that you'll encourage single parenthood. But actually, the countries with the highest levels of single parenthood are not the ones with the best support. I should say a little bit about why we're so sensitive to inequality, and I think it's a really surprising picture. Though people also say that when you visit more equal countries, you can feel the difference in the air somehow. And it's odd. We were in Sweden the other day talking about this stuff and noticed that nobody bothers to check your tickets on the trains or buses. In Britain, they check them all the time. They check them on the platform when you get onto the train, they check them on the train, they check in the toilets to see if there's anyone without a ticket hiding there. They check you when you get off again. And it's, that's a really expensive thing to do, all that checking. So I expect our public transport is more expensive, partly for reasons like that. But anyway, why are we so sensitive to inequality? I came into all this through trying to understand health inequalities. And one of the big changes in our understanding of what drives health in rich countries is that it isn't just your bad housing or your diet or whatever affecting your health directly. Very important is what you feel about your circumstances. Whether you're depressed, anxious, stressed, feeling trapped, whatever, hopeless, all those feelings associated with chronic stress do substantial physiological damage. We know how chronic stress affects the immune system and the cardiovascular system, making you more vulnerable to a wide range of diseases. But the main sources of chronic stress, shown by big studies, seem to be this one again, low social status. And remember, I mean something more like inferiority compared to superiority, rather than simply the number of cars the population has. Weak social affiliations, almost any measure of friendship, the quality of your relationship with your partner, whether you're involved in community life, how many friends you have, all those things are highly protective of health. And stress in early life is also an important risk factor. Maternal stress in pregnancy affects fetal development. But so, psychologists have always told us about how important early childhood is in the development of personality for the rest of life. We now know there's a biological side to that, affecting the development of stress responses and so on. And so early life affects the health of people my age and beyond. So making us more vulnerable to heart disease, stroke, diabetes, things like that. It seems to me, though, behind these things is maybe one common element, what I'd call perhaps some kind of social anxiety, that the insecurities that go with low social status are rather like the insecurity that go with a difficult early childhood. You know, the feelings of not being valued, and the words we use are very similar for each. Also in animal studies, we know that both of those, low social status and stress in early life, lead to higher levels of stress hormones. And friendship fits into that, because if you have friends, they make you feel better about yourself. You know, they enjoy your cooking, they enjoy your company, they like your jokes or whatever. But if people avoid you, don't include you, you feel excluded, we all start feeling maybe I'm unattractive, boring, socially gauche, you know. People don't want to be with somebody like me. We're very vulnerable to that kind of thing. Thomas Sheff, an American psychologist, talks about shame and embarrassment as the social emotions. And says that we're so vulnerable to them, we feel them so strongly because they are designed to make our behavior, make us conform, behave in acceptable ways. And of course, as creatures who depend on a learned culture, learned behavior rather than an instinctive behavior, we learn it because we are aware of other people's, how other people see us. We don't want to make fools of ourselves. And so an animal that depends on learned behavior, which of course we teach ourselves, it has to be very sensitive to other people's judgments of us. And of course that feeling that you want to disappear into the ground and wish the ground to swallow you up because you've done something stupid. We do experience ourselves through each other's eyes. That's part of being the social beings we are. So I'd thought of that kind of interpretation of these things as the most likely, and then I came across a study which went through a meta-analysis of several hundred studies in which student volunteers, nearly always student volunteers, had been invited to come into the psychological laboratory and given rather stressful things to do while having their cortisol levels measured. You can measure it in blood or saliva quite easily. And they were given tasks like doing mathematical problems or being videoed while you do something, or to make you more self-conscious, or having to write about an unpleasant experience you had. Lots of different kinds of things used to stress people experimentally. Anyway, what the study was interested in, what the meta-analysis was interested in, was what kind of stressors most reliably produce that physiological response of raised cortisol levels. And this is what they found. It was tasks with social evaluative threat, where you could be judged negatively, tasks with threatened self-esteem and social status. That's what really gets to us. It is what other people think of us. And it is, of course, also why violence is more common in more unequal societies. It's because violence is triggered by disrespect, humiliation, loss of face, things like that. And as Kate said, in more unequal societies, there is more status competition. And people are more often excluded from the trappings of status, you know, the good jobs and houses and cars and clothes and so on. A prison psychiatrist who worked in prisons with really violent people for 25 years said, "I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed and humiliated, disrespected and ridiculed." Now, that's why there's so many studies which show that violence is more common in more unequal societies. And of course, you know, having second-rate goods shows you're a second-rate person. That's the fear all the time. Another way in which you can see that we're vulnerable to these sort of social stereotypes is a number of kinds of experiments called all on what they call stereotype threat, which show how performance on all sorts of different tasks is affected by fears that you're seen negatively. This is results of some research done by people at the World Bank. They asked Indian children from high and low castes to do little mazes, find their way into the center of a maze on a piece of paper, and they had to see how many they could do in a given time. They did it sometimes when they didn't know each other's caste, and then they also did them where they'd had to say what caste they came from. They'd had to say what their father did, which village they came from, things like that. And the lower caste kids, yes, performance drops away. And you probably know there are experiments with the stereotype threat looking at the effects on ethnicity in relation to performance in different areas, or between men and women. You can get men and women to do similar tasks, spatial things, mathematical things. They do them pretty well as well. And then you suggest subtly, perhaps, that women are often thought to be less good at these things, and women's performance then falls off. Some of you know the Blue Eyes experiment with kids in primary school a long time ago, which showed similar things even at young ages. It seems to me, though, that what we're talking about is the extent to which material differences are the sort of backbone or scaffold on which all the cultural markers of social status grow, if you like. And economists like Robert Frank, with his luxury fever or falling behind, have shown how much people use their money to express status. And also the French sociologist Bourdieu has spent a long time doing that too, showing how we use consumption to express status. But in a sense, I think what we have to understand is that bigger material differences give rise to bigger social distances, more feelings of superiority and inferiority, more judgments of the people at the bottom as pretty incapable, stupid lot. You know, that's how these things pan out. We're dealing with whether societies are a social pyramid, a really steep one like that, or whether we live in a society with a much flatter social hierarchy. But it's not simply that adults experience the inequality. Think of young men maybe not being able to find jobs or only at very low wages, and the effect that has on violence, typically at its peak around the early 20s. But it's also how that experience of the adult world is passed on to children. You know, we experience our social status, we experience how supportive or unsupportive social relationships are, how competitive or cooperative they are. But then experiences of adversity are passed on to children, usually quite unconsciously. Maybe you just don't have time for your kids because, you know, you're so whacked by the day's work or whatever, or you're bad-tempered, or you're depressed. And they all have similar effects on children's development. And increasingly, we know that the actual changes in gene expression, these have been demonstrated among non-human primates, of differences in the early social environment. And that's not just sort of a chance. It's not that kids are simply damaged by those less supportive early environments. It's that the early environment serves as a taster of the kind of world you're growing up in. Now, are you growing up in a world where you will depend on cooperation, on reciprocity, on which your security will depend on maintaining really good relationships with other people, where you have to be good at empathy, where you have to get people to trust you and cooperate with you? Or are you growing up in a world where other people are your rivals, where you must fight for what you can get and watch your back? It involves a completely different emotional and cognitive development. And that's what that early sensitivity is about. And so you need to think of parenting as a sort of unconscious system that is almost designed to pass on that experience of adversity and program children differently. That's what's been happening to inequality in the United States. It's not so different from what's happened in England. It's Paul Krugman has pointed out that the changes in inequality in the 20th century are driven largely by politics. It's not just market phenomenon. We know that when the income differences rose, that was partly a difference in taxes and benefits, and also changes in trade union power and things like that. It's very clear, particularly in Britain. And in Britain, we do feel that our society has become a coarser society, a tougher society, a more antisocial society. You know, that's why people talk about it as a broken society. Well, you've probably had too much already, but you can recap most of these slides on the Equality Trust website. In the book, each chapter explains the sort of links between these social problems and why they're related to inequality. So there's a chapter on teenage births, a chapter on obesity, a chapter on violence, and so on. But I think the overall message, you know, I started off by showing you that that getting richer all the time no longer brings the benefits it used to bring. What we have to do now is to stop thinking in terms of improving the quality of life by higher standards of material consumption, but think instead of improving the quality of the social environment, social relationships between us, the kind of society we live in, what it feels like, what our relationships with other people are like. But that isn't something that you solve by going to shrinks and so on. The importance of this work is it shows that there is if you like, a policy handle on the psychosocial well-being of whole societies. That the quality of social relations is built on material foundations, but those material foundations are the scale of the differences, the income differences between us that give rise to the feelings of superiority and inferiority. So I'll stop there. Thank you.